We all know there's a connection between our diet and our immune system, but do we really understand it? In this episode, nutritional therapy practitioner Angela Grover and I connect the dots between diet, leaky gut, food intolerances, and immune deficiencies. Welcome to another episode of the Hunger Hunt Feast podcast. With me today is Angela Grover. Angela's a nutritional therapy practitioner. Welcome, Angela.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Angela and I have known each other for a long time. Angela's in the beautiful state of Idaho, and how is it out there right now? Is this your best time of year?
It's actually started to cool off. Yeah, it's been in the hundreds, which is crazy for around here. So I'm
Oh
ready
wow.
for 80s. 80s is good.
Yeah, 80s is great. Yeah, what a beautiful area. I know it. Familiar with it from growing up and going to Wyoming often and going through Idaho. So that's beautiful territory. It's just nice to get outside. Good place to be out. Well, as I mentioned, Angela and I have known each other for quite a while. We exchange through social media and exchange ideas often and talk about what we're going to talk about today a little deeper. Angela, tell us a little bit about who you typically see as a client, or what are the problems that are typically presented to you when you meet with a client?
Almost everybody I see is dealing with some sort of, chronic issue. They've been to a lot of different, doctors, practitioners, and there's just a lot of chronic illness. A ton of that comes from lifestyle issues. A lot of it just, people don't really know how to eat. They don't know how to care for themselves. And it starts out with, maybe digestive issues. And then it'll be like, oh, I've got some joint pain that I'm dealing with, or my blood sugar's off. And those just kind of snowball, as you know,
Yeah,
into larger health problems.
sure. So you might see something as minor as aches, pains, don't feel good, to maybe something more like rheumatoid arthritis
Oh, yeah.
or lupus, some autoimmune issues, I would imagine. I know you're familiar. You have your own experience with Lyme.
Yes. Yeah. We see a ton of autoimmunity, and a lot of times people just they don't correlate what's going on, in their body with what they're putting in their body. They just figure, I've got this that runs in my family,
Hmm.
or, sometimes there's a work exposure if people do things like welding or mechanicking, and they've got a lot of environmental toxins. They'll kind of look to that. But that's sort of why I was brought in where I am. I currently work in an integrative medical clinic, and
Hmm.
there's just so many things that they felt like people could benefit from the nutrition portion. It's like the missing piece.
Sure. So would you say is let's say the number one common, or let's say, or even three common um, issues with the lifestyle that you know are you're quick to find, quick to address? Where would that start, or what would you start looking at, or bringing up to your client?
Yeah. Well, I almost always start with digestive issues. It is unbelievable how many people have digestive issues, and some of them are actually kind of serious. They're that person's normal, so they sometimes don't realize how much of an issue it is until we get talking and I explain kind of that. But
Sure.
digestive issues are huge. And then joint pain. We see tons and tons of people who have what, again, they kind of think might be normal aches and pains from wear and tear, or maybe they're aging a little bit. Also, extremely food and inflammation related. And then blood sugar. Um, so many people have issues with their blood sugar, and unless they've been diagnosed, as like a pre-diabetic, which is sort of the lay person's term for it, metabolic syndrome,
Right.
and then get into full-blown diabetes. So unless they're monitoring that or have been diagnosed, people don't know that their blood sugar's off.
Right. They're not taking that blood sugar. They're not looking at metric. They know they might have a little hypoglycemia now and then, a little lightheadedness. So is that something you might notice? Like, people might have that symptom that are coming to you. Is that common, or what? You said digestion and aches
Yeah.
and pains.
Mhm.
So so do you start off by would you start off addressing in their lifestyle first? How would you unpack their
I,
diet or get an idea of what they're eating?
yeah, I always take a food first approach. That's one of the things that drew me to your material and how we met online. Um, I just really you can't outrun your fork, right, is
Right.
something that people have said very, very often. And as good at some people are at being active and working out with a purpose, you've really got to have that food component. So we those are what I call like the foundations of health, right? We
Mm.
start with a properly prepared, nutrient dense, whole food diet.
Mm.
So that's just one of the biggest emphasis points that I make, because we have got to get as much of your food unprocessed as possible.
Right.
So,
And do people really understand what that means when you say that?
no,
Okay.
no,
Because it's not just me. I'm just making sure because it's,
oh
you
gosh, no.
know, I mean, I mean, not that I don't understand, but that when I speak to people, it's like
Mhm.
a whole food, they think the first thing that might come to their mind is whole grain,
I was just
right?
gonna say the
Whole
box.
grain. So it's
I've
got whole grain written on the box of processed food. And so it must be a
or
food.
yeah, that's something that I like to educate people on too, is the front labeling, made with fruit juice or contains this many grams of whole grains. And I'm like, don't pay attention to anything on the front. You gotta flip the box or the package over and read what's on the back. But yeah, with the whole grains, people always emphasize they feel a little, kind of defensive maybe sometimes when we first meet because they're sick, and I ask them to just, okay, walk me through your regular day. What does breakfast look like?
Right.
Very, very often it consists of cereal,
Mm-hmm.
or somebody might fry themselves an egg or have a little piece of bacon or something, but it's almost always with toast.
Right.
And there's waffles and just all sorts of processed grains in their whole day. It's almost like there's not a meal or a snack that doesn't contain them.
Right.
For people like you and I, that's strange,
Right.
because we eat very differently.
uh,
But it's totally constant, lots and lots of processed grains.
and would you say there's a meal frequency that is probably a little too frequent? I mean, how often are these people eating throughout the day? Many times, including snacks and stuff.
Oh, a lot of people are, the self-proclaimed grazers. They're just too busy. Their life is really crazy, and so they're constantly just grabbing something.
Mm-hmm.
And usually that something is a very convenient,
Right.
something, crackers or pretzels, and then they'll be like, "Well, I ate some string cheese with it," and so it's really just kind of
Out of the
helping.
wrapper. Yeah.
Yes, yes, exactly. And one of the hugest things are like, but I buy whole grain bread. They're like, I buy whole wheat bread. Like it has the little pieces in it and there's seeds on top and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So again, very good marketing. They sprinkle some whole stuff on top of the bread loaf. So when you see it, you're like, oh, but really when it comes to like the glycemic
Right.
load, the blood sugar effect of that food,
Right.
it's really not good to eat much of it.
So that's what you would say that is probably one of the main problems with that type of food is the glycemic load, the effect on blood sugar and insulin and so forth. Is that what we're looking at? Okay. Obviously we were talking about the insulin resistance being pre-diabetic or having a blood sugar issue, but how do you help them connect that with their digestive issues or their aches and pains? Like, can you help take us through how you would explain to them how those eating habits are tied to their issues?
Yeah, usually I go at it from a lot of people from the point of just gluten sensitivity, and I know it's not good news for most people. Just the way that the grain is raised, the way that the grain is processed, the things that are applied to it are really very triggering for a lot of people when it comes to joint pain and inflammation, autoimmunity. But on the digestive part, some of that is really hard to break down or to absorb. And so when it ends up in the body not completely digested, it's going to irritate the gut lining, right?
Right.
So then we end up with for a lot of people, simple things like indigestion, gas, and bloating. And then for other people, we're looking at, very, very sensitive one cell barrier membrane, right?
Right.
So it kind of irritates that. So once that membrane is no longer intact, almost everyone who consumes gluten, they've done these tests and it will show that it opens up the tight junctions in the intestinal lining. So
Right.
we want those to be open a tiny bit so we can absorb things, but not too big, because then pieces of undigested food can come down through. That is a huge trigger of food intolerances, autoimmunity, and tons of people that manifests in the form of joint pain.
Hmm. So what you're describing is what is called leaky gut, right?
Yes,
And that's kind of the layman's, or the buzzword on that is a
usually.
leaky gut on that. So that is what, and a lot of people hear that, but they don't really understand what that means or what would cause it. So you're talking about an
Exactly.
inflammation of that gut lining
Mm-hmm.
that allows a microscopic, I mean,
Yep,
probably not just food particles, but there are also bacteria,
exactly.
inflammatory things, cytokines. I mean, all sorts of things that would cause, um, just to help people draw the circle back to why would it cause joint pain. It creates inflammation, correct? I mean, we're talking about a direct cause of inflammation that goes, because it leaves the gut and gets into the rest of our system where it doesn't really belong. We're not made to deal with it there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So once that crosses through the intestinal barrier and into the bloodstream, it's not supposed to be there, like you said. So the body will see that as an invader or an antigen.
Mm,
So your immune system will kind of, flag it and say, this is a problem. We need to attack it and remove it. And that seems like it's simple enough. But then we get into sort of the concept of, if those are coming through every time you eat, then your immune system is going to be triggering every time they come through. Then secondarily to that,
mm. Wait. So that would create that would create an allergy to that. Like you said, every time it comes through, your leaky gut's still in place. So every time you eat this, you're triggering your immune system again to respond in a way
yes,
that's inflammatory. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to make sure that sings home, that this is not a one-time occurrence. This is an ongoing occurrence because you create a food allergy. You're actually creating a food allergy in your own.
yeah, that is how you get a food intolerance. And I'll tell you, the difference between a food allergy and a food intolerance is pretty simple.
Okay,
Food allergy is like an IgE or immunoglobulin E. That's going to be like your immediate, histamine response. Like you need an EpiPen, peanut allergy kind of.
gotcha.
So kind of fall in the allergy category. These are an IgG, immunoglobulin G, and they are a food intolerance. So your body will, you can't like take, a Benadryl or an antihistamine and have that be dampened in the body at all. It doesn't work that way. So
Gotcha. So it's not like having a peanut allergy or or a bee sting or some sort of like, someone has allergic to shellfish.
yeah,
It's an intolerance, but it's still an immune response, but it's not on the same level. It's not a histamine response. It's just um, you've got an inflammatory response for the purpose of isolating it and trying to eliminate it and protect the rest of the body
right.
from it. Okay.
It's also not a good idea to eat anything you're intolerant to, if you are susceptible at all to infection, even
Mm,
with, kind of all this COVID stuff running around. It's like a distraction for your immune system. If it has the job of going around and flagging all of these food particles that are coming through, it doesn't have the resources to properly be addressing, infections and things that are going on. So that's one of the things I really try to emphasize with people who have like chronic illnesses, maybe like, Lyme, Epstein-Barr virus, things like that. You've got to give your immune system a chance to not have to deal with all of the food intolerance issues, so you can really do what you need to do to kind of work on the virus part.
gotcha. Okay. Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I wanted to make sure there was because that is a little fuzzy
Yes,
unknown that the public doesn't always, and including myself, I'm a little fuzzy on the difference between I'm glad you explained it, an intolerance and an allergy.
right.
There's that histamine response does make a big difference. So
Mhm.
you're talking about it leaves the body and it comes back around. But so when we eat that food consistently, we're constantly gonna have that reaction, as opposed to when there's no inflammation, those joints stay closed and everything stays where it's supposed to be.
Yes.
The food, everything can be handled properly. I'm not sure where you were going right before I interrupted you.
Oh, you're totally fine. But basically, we were talking about like why that causes inflammation,
Okay,
and the 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 difference between basically food allergy is acute, food intolerance is chronic. And nobody needs more chronic inflammation, especially with everything that we deal with in our food system and our environment, things like that. But let's jump on what sugar does.
oh
That
sure,
that's like
favorite
one-
subject.
oh once we get past, like, we're like, okay, whole food and then sugar in specific. Like if I can get people to just not eat so many processed grains and totally get rid of the white sugar, it's going to make a huge difference. And everybody's like, well, it causes inflammation. And I don't think, same thing, I don't think they really plug into exactly what it does in their body. So sugar can increase C-reactive protein,
Mm,
right? Which is a lot of times measured as a cardiac risk factor, overall inflammation in the body. There's also long-term use or consumption on like a high sugar diet will increase inflammatory cytokines. Those can have effects on your the extremities of your allergies, increasing, joint pain. And then of course, there's always more insulin because in the
right,
presence of those carbohydrates that need to be escorted into the cell to be used for energy, we have insulin. And insulin is not just the word that everybody's like, oh, that's for blood sugar. Insulin is a hormone,
right.
and it sends all sorts of messages out to your body. And there is a huge correlation between chronically high insulin levels and heart disease. It's extremely,
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Heart disease, not just diabetes, heart disease and Alzheimer's and cancer.
yep,
I mean, basically all the lifestyle diseases growth can come from insulin or some disturbance of or hyperinsulinemia, high levels of insulin
exactly.
chronically, not a spike where you just ate a meal, but where it's chronically
Yes,
elevated in the system is what you're talking about. You're not talking about you just sat down, had a big meal, it went up, and then 2 hours later, 3 hours later, it came back down and like normal. It's when it's chronically elevated through, like you mentioned, grazing, constantly eating high carb processed foods to the point that it becomes a systemic
yep,
issue. It's systemically elevated.
yeah,
So, okay.
yeah, it definitely is. And you get into where like it's just this terrible kind of 1-2 punch, and we're doing it to ourselves with the way that we eat. So
Mm,
you have all of the processed grains, and then you have the processed fats, the ones that have been sold to us like they're so much healthier for you. Canola oil
right,
especially is just terrible. That they oxidize, right? They're
right,
not really stable even as they come out of the manufacturer. So then you've got the high insulin, and you have these really unstable, oxidized, low quality fats. And you kind of put those two things together, and it wreaks havoc on like the endothelial lining,
mm,
of your arteries and just everything. So those are two things, that and the sugar, I guess, three things that I'm just constantly trying to drive home to people is the processed grains. Please get rid of the sugar, and here's a list of healthy fats and how to cook with them.
yeah. I've actually just bought another tub of lard from this very special pig.
Oh,
It's a gourmet lard to cook with, and I've always used
yeah,
coconut oil for years and
good,
collect bacon grease, bacon drippings.
right.
Um, but when you talk about, to go back to those three you just mentioned, I mean, those are the three main ingredients in processed foods: is
Oh, wow.
sugar, processed grains, and the oils. The oils being, yeah, canola is sold as being the heart healthy one, and
Oh,
yet it's so inflammatory. And there's the big eight. Kate Shanahan is called the big eight, the hateful eight.
mm.
Um, Oils. It's the soy, corn, safflower, sunflower, canola, cottonseed,
Cottonseed.
grapeseed, and rice bran oil. Is that right? Um, and they're just all, like you said, from their production, they are already going rancid. They're getting
They are.
oxidized in from light and heat in the bottle from their processing. And
Yeah.
then when you cook with them, or they're
Yep.
processed into the food, there's heat.
Exactly.
The they are used as a preservative and to add some flavor in that food to some degree, but they're still oxidizing, and they're
Mhm.
creating this. It's like a when we eat them, a free radical cascade. So free radicals, causing damage. They're causing inflammation that almost, it's like playing tag, except that it doesn't shift off of the the cell or the molecule that just hit. It's like continues to spread
Yeah.
the free radical and the inflammation throughout the system every time it touches it and robs another oxygen
Yep.
atom. So it creates like a string of events that are all inflammatory. And
Yeah.
that's about, average American's diet is made up of about 60 to 70% of their diet is typical, made up of either at least one, if not all three of those mixed together in a processed
Yep.
food. So people, I don't eat that. It's in 60 to 70% of the average American's diet.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And people do not realize how much of it they're consuming.
No,
Um,
it's so
the
nutrient dense, it's so calorie dense that when they eat it,
Right.
compared to eating, if they were to eat like a 6 ounce steak or about 3 or 4 eggs or and maybe some broccoli with a little butter on top, uh, you know,
Butter.
oh, mm,
That is,
that's a magical word in my house. Butter is a
yeah,
magical word.
yeah, butter is a fun one. People will ask me all of the time about both butter and coconut oil, and they just always say, is butter bad for you? And it's really fun for me to tell them heavens no, right?
Right.
So it just has to do with a lot of our social conditioning, a lot of our what's in the media, what we're just kind of being spoon fed about what is and isn't healthy. So
Well, it's our
none of
dietary guidelines. Well, it's what our government's been telling us for 50 years, or almost 60. I
yeah,
mean, so it's really, and what doctors are almost told to repeat, uh,
yep,
you know,
yep,
so,
absolutely.
so it's certainly a campaign beyond just, I mean, there's corporate interest behind that, but it has been reinforced by the people who are supposed to be our health authorities. And that's what's available in the schools, prisons, military, and elderly care homes that are run by the state. That's the food. That's the lineup they get of food. Um, so heavily reinforced, and it's really hard to communicate that to people. That's why it's like such a paradigm shift for people to move away from margarine to butter, or like you said, like what healthy fats are you pushing people towards? Are you kind of guiding them to say to move towards how do you help them unpack the difference between the typical vegetable oils, as they're called, the seed oils,
Yeah,
and what you would call healthy fats, and what are those healthy fats? So let's just help people out right now. Let's
sure.
tell them what actually, because healthy fats is thrown around, but the definition of healthy fats
Exactly.
has two different schools of thought
Yep,
that are in direct opposition to each other. So let's
yep.
let's talk about the healthy fats, the real healthy fats.
Yeah, the list that people get from me, like there's a handout that I give people, and
Mm,
it always includes, coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil, butter, grass fed, preferably. And then we get into where people really have lots of trouble is the animal fats. And
right.
they'll there's always a lot of discussion around this because they're like, those are inflammatory, or those lead to cancer, or those cause heart disease. But I will tell people, like you were just mentioning, I have grass fed lard in my freezer. Same thing. We found a good supplier and went and bought some of that. I use duck fat. I keep
Yes.
bacon drippings in my house. Let me think. I don't take the skin off the chicken. I eat the fat that's on the side of my steak. It's just something that not a lot of people do, and they're taught to be afraid of.
Right.
So
Right. And yet there's
they
so many nutrients in that fat.
oh yeah,
That's
Yeah.
where a lot of them are. A lot of our minerals that we want, and the A, D, K, E,
Yeah, your fat solubles.
your fat soluble vitamins and minerals, magnesium. I mean, there are a lot of them are, well, I mean, there's so many that, and it depends on which, whether you're looking at shellfish like oysters or a beef, a cow. Now, most people aren't. We should have known there was a problem when they started telling us that shellfish were bad for us because they had cholesterol in them. That should have been a big red flag in the 80s,
Yeah, yeah.
um, because of the amount of true needed micronutrients in those fish. I, I I'm still like
Like, because of what we know now, it just like part of your brain has to almost like be removed for you to think differently about that. And when
yes.
when it comes to the education on like the inflammatory process, I'll get all sciencey on people if they really need to know the nitty gritty of it. And there's a lot of it that has to do with your different prostaglandins, right? So
Mm,
we'll look into that and they'll say, well, these are inflammatory. And a lot of times when they do the studies and they'll show that, eating this kind of fat is pro-inflammatory, this is a yin and yang. So they've taken that out of context. And what happens is your body's inflammatory process needs to have a certain, kind of like a window or order. If you get a paper cut, right, it usually
mm,
kind of swells up a little bit, gets kind of red and puffy for a few days, and then it will start to go down and heal. That's the same with inflammation. You need a broad range of the different types of fatty acids, because if you don't have the one prostaglandin in function, it's not going to trigger the anti-inflammatory processes.
mm, correct.
So it really is necessary to consume, the whole spectrum of fatty acids. So yes, olive oil is fantastic. Yes, eat your avocados. The monounsaturated fats have a place. Mix them in there. That's great. But a lot of those, like your olive oil, you don't want to cook with that at a high temperature,
Mm,
because it will, the smoke point is lower. It will oxidize at a lower temperature.
right.
So that's another part of the why the animal fats are so good to incorporate into certain types of cooking, because they're stable at the higher temperature.
Right. They're not going to oxidize as quickly. They're not going to
Exactly.
have that oxidation effect in our system because they're all there. To get technical, like you said, all the carbon change is full.
Yes.
There's not an open spot for oxidation to come in and take place, whereas a polyunsaturated has more open places because it's unsaturated. So it's stable versus unstable. And that is true. It's not really understood what that means. Polyunsaturated versus unsaturated. People just think one clogs my arteries,
Oh,
and it's just not how it works. It's not even how heart disease works. There's no fat, like if there's fat in your arteries, it's because insulin's been packing around your heart. It's not because you ate fat or you have a high cholesterol, level. I mean, so you get to now in your practice, where you're in that you work within,
mhm.
you get access to probably more things than your average nutritionist, or certainly more than your average trainer or dietitian would get to. You get to see, you have a nurse practitioner seeing, overseeing everything. So you get to see some blood work, some lipid panels.
Yeah,
So
all
what kind of red flags do you look for in those lipid panels? When you're looking at a lipid panel, what would make you say, okay, we definitely need to address um, carbs, sugar in the diet? What is it? What would be your first few flags when you're looking at a lipid panel?
I generally put a little bit more emphasis on the ratio of
Okay.
what's there for the cholesterol than the whole cholesterol number, because I think that differs with people. I think telling people that, like, this one level is just it, and if yours is above that, then it's bad. That's all an individual thing for me.
Hmm.
And triglycerides.
Yeah,
We always look at triglycerides, and they also pull their hemoglobin A1C.
sure.
So, I'm sure your listeners already probably know all this, but basically 3-month average of what your blood sugar is, and kind of sort of a percentage of how many of your blood cells have been, um, you know, glycated or kind of changed and made sticky
Hmm.
by the levels of glucose.
So basically, you look at glucose levels and triglycerides. While those are fat molecules, they're usually high because of a lot of sugar intake. Correct.
Yes,
Not from
yes.
eating steak.
No,
Okay.
that's another huge education point. A lot of people that come in, if they've got uh, issues in their family with heart disease and things like that, they're like, ah, doc told me I'm eating way too much fat. And then I just walk them through it. I walk them through, the process of the stored glucose, and that, hey, we've got this thing called glycogen that's put away for later. And if your body is not, if it's not utilizing that, if it's not being, changed into glucose for use to burn as energy, then
Mm,
it's going to store in the liver. If you have more of it than can be stored in the liver, we're just going to come up with, it converts them into triglycerides.
mm.
So triglycerides are not from excess fat, they are from excess carbohydrates.
Right. And those are actually getting transported through the blood
Yes.
by LDL
Yep.
particles.
Yep.
So if your LDL is high, let's just use this as an example because it doesn't mean it doesn't have one meaning, or it doesn't tell it's not telling you something clearly just because your LDL is high. It can be high for
Right.
different reasons. It can be high because your triglycerides are high, which means you're eating too much sugar,
Yes.
or it could be high because an inflammatory response, because our body responds to inflammation and viruses, or cortisol levels are in stress, and we create cortisol with true cholesterol that's being transported in the LDL. So there could be more than one reason that an LDL count, serum LDL, could be high. But I would say most cases, if you see triglycerides are up, you know that the LDL is high, not because they're eating too many egg yolks, but because they're eating a lot of sugar and grains, and possibly some inflammatory um, oils, just
Almost
because of,
always.
yeah, almost always. Okay, there we
Almost
go. Okay, I was just soft pitching that. You're like, hey, you might be eating this, but you're right.
always.
It's almost always.
Yeah, it's almost always.
Yeah. So someone who's eating let's say a contrast that with a low carb, doesn't not even have to be ketogenic, but let's say it's a lower carb, higher fat diet, their triglycerides would be lower typically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so would their LDL or their cholesterol be higher in some cases, or could it be high, but it's not something that would cause alarm?
Right. I've seen elevated cholesterol before, and in a lot of the education that I do, constantly learning, that there are people in the space that will say you really don't, like 300 even don't, and that's going to scare a lot of people
Don't
because they're,
sweat it. Yeah.
yeah, don't sweat it. They're used to just having like this hard and fast rule of a certain number,
Mhm.
and versus what you were mentioning, looking at the makeup of the cholesterol and those other markers. I never ever suggest just looking at the total cholesterol. There's always an underlying story there. So yeah, I do see people with higher cholesterol levels, and um, I have had what the conventional numbers
Mhm.
call slightly elevated cholesterol before. No symptoms whatsoever, none of the other markers anywhere where anyone would consider them at all a concern.
Mhm.
It's just, I was working on being able to further digest my fats because that was an issue before. And once I got my digestion right, I found I didn't have to eat as much fat. I felt full, quicker.
Mm.
So, but just
Gotcha.
in the process of that, there was a little bit of an elevation, and I'm not at all concerned.
Right. So you were looking at, like you mentioned, ratios before, the HDL to triglyceride ratio, I'm guessing, is what you're
Yes.
referring to. So keeping those triglycerides low, usually try to keep them, say, under 150, under 100. What's your typical goal
Um,
for people?
Triglycerides, I honestly like to see, this is gonna sound super, super low. I like them to be under 120.
Under
Uh,
120, sure.
right. So conventional ranges and functional ranges are different. When we go and get our blood tested almost all the time, those are run against conventional ranges. And conventional is from an average pool of people. And this is America. Our average pool of people is sick, right?
I 100%. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So functional ranges are ideal. like this, that they take them from very healthy people and optimal ranges. So I kind of like to look functional more than I do conventional. A lot of times people they'll be symptomatic in many different ways, and they'll say, my blood work is normal. So then I kind of have to walk them through that
What
process.
normal means.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, you just
Average.
saw that. I'm sure you saw that study that just came out. It was just in the last month. I think it was out of North Carolina. One of those medical. I really can't remember where it came from, but it was showed only 12% of the U.S. population is metabolically healthy. So you're talking about 1 in 8 doesn't have some issue with metabolic disease. Everyone else has got some kind of, either it could be triglycerides, it could be their blood sugar, or hypertension. It could be, it's some, usually it's a spectrum of those. It's usually more than one, or if you only got one, you caught it early. Um, but I mean, 12% are healthy, so 88% are not, and heading towards lifestyle diseases. It's sad. It's alarming.
Yes.
Unfortunately, not surprising,
No. Um,
considering how we eat and how we live. And if you take a look around and you look at a picture of the population, general public now in any large city, and then take the same picture of a population in the same city 40 years ago or 30 years ago, let's say 50 years, let's say in the 70s, early 70s, you're going to notice a difference in how people are shaped and how
oh,
much, yeah, I mean,
like
a
all you have
dramatic.
to do to confirm that, like go back and watch like footage of the World War II.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, the way that the men were built. They're just very lean and like barrel chested, and like it's just completely different. There's a lot of like we've all developed kind of like for men it's love handles, for women it's muffin top, whatever, and the having that fat around your middle, although very typical, like you said, very normal,
Mm-hmm.
is concerning, especially if people are measuring or doing the metrics on any of that, looking at the visceral fat. We've
Right.
talked about that fairly extensively, and it's very toxic. It's very toxic to your organs. Fat is not inert. It doesn't just hang out and do nothing, and you're like, oh, I don't like the way I look in my jeans. That aesthetics are nice, but functionality of the body is extremely important.
Right. So there's a big difference between the visceral fat and the subcutaneous fat, where the subcutaneous fat, unless it's to a certain level, is often less impactful on our health, unless you get to a level of obesity where it can be more active and have a little more impact on us hormonally. But that fat that gathers, visceral being not just on the belly, but like underneath the muscle around,
So
usually starting with the liver, pancreas, kidneys, heart, and that creates these problems with blood sugar and um, kidney disease, heart disease, all these things we deal with. They start with a level of insulin resistance and fat accumulation around the organs in that visceral area, um, and they're very hormonally sensitive, but hormonally influencing. Let's just say that's one way. I think one way of putting it is they have an influence over the hormone balance going on, and as those our brain is talking to those organs and giving signals. It's the imbalance. It's a battle of hormones. At that point, it's not about calories. It's
right,
it's hormones, and how the
right.
food we're eating is creating the hormones that are causing the function, as you mentioned, the function to be impaired in our organs. And that's the fat we can't see and you really can't measure without an MRI, or at the very least a bioimpedance. Like some kind of calipers are going to measure that. You
Mhm.
might notice that your pants are getting thicker or tighter around the waist, or your waist is getting bigger, and you could chalk that up to maybe an extra roll around, a little extra fat under the skin. But that's not
Yeah.
always what's happening. Sometimes it's the spread from the fat accumulation under the muscle around those organs, and that's what's killing you a lot more than the fat on the back of your arms, or that's on your thighs. That's While that's what you can see, and probably more of an alarm, people kind of want to, how do I get rid of this?
Yep.
Let's start with getting your organs functioning first, get the fat off your organs so that you can then burn off your fat. Let's heal your metabolism and your body and reduce some inflammation. And then this other fat will come off with much more
Yeah. It
ease,
I
inside out.
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the calorie thing because I just think that that has been hyper emphasized, over the last, couple of decades. I'm glad that it's sort of shifting,
Yeah,
uh,
slowly.
eh, painfully slowly sometimes, but
Yeah,
I have some clients that are a little bit weirded out because I don't have them count calories. I have them plate ratio,
sure.
right? So first of all, I think it's much easier to track than it is. Some people are very data driven and they want to know all of the details and the metrics, and that's cool. If they want to know that, I point them towards tools that they can use to do that.
Right. Yeah. Use an app because I'm not counting them for you.
Exactly. Exactly. And then other people, they're like, I don't have time for that. Like, I don't want to keep track of, A, B, or C. I'm like, that's totally fine because you don't have to with me.
Right.
So I work on off of the plate ratio, and this has not been taught, but maybe for about the last several years in more popular circles. But it's just like half a plate non-starchy vegetables, right? Like, eat as many non-starchy vegetables as you want,
Mhm.
and then the top, 2 quarters, we're going to put our, healthy sourced protein, a whole food carbohydrate, something
Mhm.
like a sweet potato, maybe a brown rice, something like that, but always, always whole food carbohydrate. And then we want to add the healthy fat to either, your vegetable or your starch. And if you have blood sugar issues, you probably need to eat even a little bit of a smaller, portion of that until you can get kind of your insulin sensitivity and things figured out. You might have to eat fewer carbohydrates than some other people. And if you're very active, as you know,
Yeah.
then you can kind of cycle those around your activity and eat
Mhm.
a few more carbohydrates, but always whole food.
Right. Whole food is as a source, not processed, and yeah, I adjust the carb intake. So you adjust the carb intake based on the need of the person's, whether it's correcting blood sugar or if they're healthy, metabolically healthy, what's their
Yeah,
activity level.
right.
You can't put everybody in the same box
No,
as far as carb intake. It's what's your goal? What are you trying to heal, or what are you
exactly.
trying to accomplish? Someone who's like maybe a competitive athlete who trains 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day is
Yeah,
going to need a different rate macronutrient ratio than someone who is metabolically unhealthy and who is lucky to get 2 hours of moderate exercise a week.
right.
Yeah, I mean, so you can't, yeah, we can't just put everybody in the same box. But generally speaking, it sounds like though you do start with the vegetables, non-starchy, and a good whole food protein that is not necessarily lean, but
No,
is yeah.
no. It doesn't need to be lean. And I always have them kind of, I encourage people to do what I call a food mood journal, so they can track, you know, what did I eat this day? What was my activity level? What were my symptoms? Things like that. Because if they're still feeling hungry, they're like, well, I ate what was in the meal plan, but I still felt hungry. Then I always encourage them. I'm like, okay, so let's add a little bit more protein. Let's add a little bit more fat, because if you're
Mhm.
eating half a plate of non-starchy vegetables, you're pretty much already, covered for like your fiber. And if you're eating, the rainbow, or being diverse in the
Mhm.
the types of vegetables we're eating, then you're covering a lot of your different nutrition and you're good for fiber. So if they're still hungry, that's what I encourage them to add, is more protein or more fat. And then we just kind of
Sure.
adjust that
Put some
as well.
butter on that steak.
Like fresh cracked black pepper,
Yeah.
push through the butter on the plate.
Oh yeah. Good stuff. Yeah. So with vegetables, that brings up a good subject. So there's a lot of talk about lectins and oxalates, things with nuts and vegetables, things that are thought of as healthy food, and they certainly have good nutrients in them. But there are people who have negative reactions to it. They have a hard time digesting a certain level of fiber that maybe it's just they're a little more sensitive to it than your average person.
Oh,
Um, okay, there you go. So, I mean, I didn't even notice as we've gotten older, we need to eat more. We feel like we need to eat more cooked vegetables, a lot less
Yeah.
salad.
Mm.
Salad tends to make feel more bloated. We used to have these big salads, let's say 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, and now it's like, let's just steam some broccoli, or we'll grill some veggies or cook some veggies in the oven, kind of roast them, um, just to help break that fiber down, release some of those nutrients. And what I guess it's doing is really is taking is I guess it's having an effect on those lectins and some of those oxalates to, well, the lectins really, to not be so impactful. Is that, help me out with that?
Yeah. So that when I mentioned in the beginning, when I say properly prepared, right, nutrient dense food, a ton of the ancestral cultures, they used to soak, sprout, or ferment almost everything.
Right.
If you're looking for, the breaking down of the phytates or the lectins or things like that, you can pressure cook your lentils, you can soak or sprout your nuts. And a lot of that, there was a huge amount of buzz around like the anti-nutrients,
Right.
through paleo movement. People would go paleo and then they would find sometimes that they were developing some intolerances to all the nuts or something. Well, if your body has difficulty digesting those, one, chew them very, very well.
Yeah.
And then secondarily to that, if you find that you're having trouble with specific foods, then look at kind of how they're prepared. You can dissipate, reduce, break down, whatever word you want to use, a lot of the lectins and phytates just by the food preparation.
Hmm.
And then in addition to that is, of course, as we age, there's a just very natural reduction in the amount of stomach acid we produce. So, having a little bit of apple cider vinegar, something like um, digestive bitters, things that can sort of stimulate that, is very helpful. And I don't know, just if you can't break down and digest the food, first of all, you're almost always going to have some digestive, upset with that. And then secondarily, you're not getting all of the like gorgeous whole food nutrients out of the food. You're going to all of the effort and the expense to buy these quality foods, and then you can't fully digest them.
Right.
So yeah,
I think it would affect the digestion of the other foods that you're eating as well. For instance, if you're using all your stomach acid
yeah,
to try to break down a lot of raw vegetables, then when you get to your meat, which you really need stomach acid for, to try to pull those nutrients out of the fat and break the protein, you might have some you might be a little less acidic than you need to be from that
right,
acid to help with that digestion. We found the same thing. I definitely have included apple cider vinegar as a daily routine.
awesome.
For me, for that very reason, I just found my stomach acid, especially getting older, uh, just isn't what it used to be.
Yeah,
And
a
and that's
lot of people, a lot of people have trouble digesting the raw foods, and that will get controversial. But people like you and I are not exactly shy about controversy. So,
no.
with the raw food, there are enzymes in the food, and I completely understand, consuming some of your food raw. But there are people that are so digestively compromised that they cannot break down a raw vegetable. So
Right.
like we'll have very low glycemic smoothies, things that are very much like berry based, full fat coconut milk, things like that. So we're not having the huge blood sugar spike. Soups, things that are cooked in a, crock potted or pressure cooker. So
Yeah.
they're just kind of broken down and easier to digest. We might need to add in some supplemental hydrochloric acid, pancreatic enzyme. Some people even need some bile salts so they can break down their fats.
Mm.
But once you kind of, trigger the things up north, then the other processes that happen further down in the digestive process, they kind of they kind of trigger things like a domino effect. So when people are unhealthy and they're like, I need a probiotic, I always encourage them to look at the processes that happen further upstream so we can kind of get the body to trigger those mechanisms on its own versus always supplementing.
Right. So the stomach acid is in the stomach and the small intestine. Well, then it goes from the stomach, but the acids in the stomach, the bacteria we're talking about, the
Right.
biome is in the large intestine where all the fermentation takes place of the fiber. And by the time it gets there, you've probably already irritated some stuff. And then
Yeah.
once it gets there and starts trying to ferment, then you get your your bloating. So if you probably deal with a little bit of SIBO issues coming in at times, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, they'll sometimes run like a GI map on people if they have chronic digestive issues. And since let me pop over to kind of how this rolls into the autoimmunity.
Okay,
So
please do.
yeah, brush border enzymes. Not something that everybody talks about. They're literally things, like phytase, right? So anything that ends in ASE, like lactase breaks down lactose, phytase breaks down phytates. And we have those all along, our intestine. And if we don't have the brush border enzymes, there again, like you said, with that fiber, it gets down there and it just really, really irritates the gut. And again, there's the fermentation, and we can kind of feed the not so great, things in the microbiome. So then we end up with an imbalance in the gut bacteria, and that can cause all sorts of issues. So if your gut is permeable and you have an imbalance in bacteria, we've got all of that nasty bacteria and all of that undigested food coming into the bloodstream. So we've got the inflammation already, but then there's a concept called molecular mimicry, especially with food proteins.
Hmm,
So if we have something, like gluten or casein, right, those are molecularly similar to one another, and often why people who can't tolerate gluten also have a problem with dairy. So there are tissues in your body, and they're made up of proteins. If your body is running around flagging, and putting these like, hey, that's a foreign protein, it doesn't belong here. If there's something in your body tissue that looks similar or is structured similarly to that molecularly, your immune system will begin to attack that, autoimmunity, which is basically self intolerance.
right.
So you constantly have this immune activity to things like, a thyroid. You're looking at things like, Hashimoto's disease, or your rheumatoid or different kinds of arthritis. Um, your body can become self-immune to any tissue in the body.
Wow.
So not having those foods digested is a much bigger issue than, oh, I've got a little stomach ache and maybe I'm not fully absorbing all of my nutrients. It can lead to very serious systemic inflammation and then autoimmunity.
So that's where the joint inflammation, would that be, would that correlate with what you're talking about, or is that a different type of response for as an example?
One of the reasons that I talk so much with people about the gluten sensitivity when they're, when they're having the joint pain, is because the molecular mimicry concept is very tied into like cartilage and joint health. So there's
Wow.
definitely, yeah, there's definitely that. And a lot of people just don't know, you can get them to remove some of the foods that they are intolerant to. And a lot of the times their joint pain will significantly decrease within a fairly short period of time. It's not a magic bullet. It's one piece of the puzzle, but it can be a big one for a lot of people.
Okay. And then of course that you're talking about autoimmune responses, Hashimoto's,
Yeah.
rheumatoid arthritis, which of course would deal with joints, um, and lupus would
Yeah.
be, you feel see a lot of women now. It seems like more of them at a younger age
Yep.
dealing
It
with lupus.
women more than it does men.
Yes, tends to. Yes, and
Mhm.
that's so that would all be in line with what this sort of molecular mimicry, where we're attacking ourselves because of um, these food intolerances and this immune response we're creating through
Yeah. There,
lifestyle.
uh-huh. There's a loss of what's called oral tolerance, which is a lot of, ingesting the food proteins and your body's intolerance to those. And then there's a loss of chemical tolerance. So usually the food sensitivities will show up first, and then people will start having issues with, if they walk into the detergent aisle or the scented candles, and they're like, oh man, they'll get a headache, you know?
Yes.
So there's the chemical intolerance, and then we tend to fall into self intolerance kind of after that. And one of the biggest issues with all of this, intolerance or the autoimmunity are your T regulatory cells. And you've got to have healthy gut lining and also liver. People don't tie the liver issues into autoimmunity, but that's huge. There are these things, and this is sort of new to me. I'm just kind of learning about this. There are these things in the liver called Kupffer cells,
Okay.
Kupfer, and they're very, very tied into sort of that elevated or overactive reaction
Okay.
in autoimmunity.
Hmm.
So once you've kind of had these things come through, there are T cells that are supposed to do things in the immune system, and then there are the T regulatory cells, right? They're the guys that are just kind of saying, okay, enough activity over here, more activity over here, and those go absolutely haywire in autoimmunity. So it just isn't, it's not regulated.
Hmm. So you just have this response that keeps perpetuating itself in many cases.
Yep. Yep. And that's when you end up with like a lot of these chronic, issues. And I hate to say that they may not be completely caused by lifestyle, but they are heavily, heavily influenced and often made worse by it.
Hmm.
You might have a genetic propensity towards that, but there's always like genetics plus environment, kind of equals health. Your The things you're exposed to, the type of stress you have, what you're putting into your body with the genetic influence, that's all part of the picture.
The epigenetics, yeah, the environment or what you put in your body, as you said, triggers
Totally.
and turns on a genetic propensity for something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how the heat? Let's talk about healing process. So are people able to reverse? I mean, they're going to have these. A lot of people have these symptoms with let's say rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah.
Major. I'm seeing it more and more and again with a lot of women um, in their 40s,
Oh yeah.
and and just and they seem healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to look at them, and they probably have healthy lifestyles. They were very active, um, but they're falling prey. So obviously, something has triggered an autoimmune response in their body to hit these joints. What what is the protocol? I mean, so they start eliminating certain foods. They kind of calm the gut down.
Yeah.
Are they able to reverse these symptoms? Do the symptoms just subside for as long as the gut is not inflamed? I mean, how I know, and there's not like one answer for that, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
I know. Yeah. And I think I kind of get where you're going with that. As far as I'm aware, there's not a cure
Right.
for autoimmunity. Autoimmunity is sort of like really a lot of other things that we deal with. They're manageable, they're highly manageable, but it does take sort of like the peeling back all of the layers of the onion. There's never just one thing. And people get very discouraged because it can be complex and it can take quite a while. But you're definitely on the right track with the gut. You have to have um, a healthy detoxification system, right? So
Right.
all of the things that your body's trying to rid itself of are not hanging around and making the inflammation and the toxicity worse.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have to have a gut that, digestive system that is operating correctly. So you're not only getting your nutrients that you need to be healed out of the food, but that we're not having those things pass through, and be irritating the immune system all the time. So yeah, proper digestion, intact gut lining, definitely need to look at the detox pathways. So we're not overburdened with all of those things. And then generally, a lot of the people that we see, they've got some kind of, either very chronic chemical exposure or um, like a chronic viral infection or something of, even if it's just candida.
Hmm.
I should say just because that's not always very easy to get rid of, but
But it's
there,
common.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep. With the sugar consumption and all the fermentation with the grains and everything, uh, there's very, very often there'll be a parasite or something like candida or chronic infection like Lyme or Epstein-Barr, things like that. Very, very common.
Mm,
So there's generally, kind of half a dozen areas that you kind of have to address with people. And once you start kind of peeling those things back, you can see really major changes.
mm. Good. So, like you said, manageable. So they're asymptomatic to a large degree,
Hmm.
um, through lifestyle changes. So primarily diet. Is that what you're saying for the most
Oh,
part? I mean,
always, 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 always food first.
food
And
first. Okay.
yeah, and having dealt with active Lyme disease myself in the past,
Mhm.
there are things about your body that change. Sometimes you don't get to go back to 100% of what you were before. There'll be a little residual. It's kind of like I like to think of it as just enough to remind you that you need to stay on track. And I I have to be pretty careful about what I eat, and it's just a part of it now. I don't look at it like it's always a recreation thing, food. I eat to keep myself healthy and on track. And when I get a little off track and maybe I'm running so many different directions and I'm stressed out or things like that, stuff can get a little teetery. So everybody has to take care of themselves.
So not so diet, stress, sleep,
Yeah.
basically managing anything that would cause stress in the
Yeah.
body. Okay.
Yeah.
So those basic things that would cause chronic stress, which we often unfortunately underestimate, um, diet and sleep in that regard. When you talking about stress, those are highly underestimated. But you'd say start with diet, get your
Yes.
sleep consistent, and manage your stress level. And um, that could be working out. That could be, you know, like what level. Like, do you have a very stressful day? You're not getting much sleep. Diet was a little off.
Yeah.
Maybe adjust your workout a bit for the amount of energy you have, for the amount of stress you're feeling.
Definitely.
So even good things that are supposed to create uh, an acute amount of stress, like you mentioned before, for the adaptation to create antioxidants, vegetables,
Yes.
similar thing. They create acute amount of stress in many cases when you're adjusting fiber, or these oxalates or so forth, to create an antioxidant response, but they can be overwhelming. And when they get to the point they're overwhelming, then you have a problem. So it's really about a dose response, and that can be very individual,
Yep.
is what I'm hearing. And it can be individual even based on the week.
That is totally true. You'll find that like what you were doing, last year or the year before that worked really well for you and your body was just in the groove and you were getting the results that you wanted, and your body's not static. It shifts all the time and you do need to shift with it.
Mm,
So like you said, if you have an off day, if you have an off week, I encourage people very much to get in tune with their symptoms. All of the distance clients that I work with, we do something called the NAC, which is the Nutritional Assessment Questionnaire. It's very, very symptom driven. And that's not to follow the allopathic way of things where you're addressing the symptom. It's to get people to listen to
mm,
their bodies because we run around so busy all the time. Sometimes I'll ask them, "Do you ever have this? Do you ever have that?" And they're like, "I, I guess my feet do hurt at the end of every day," or "Yeah, I do have, a little bit of a headache a few times a week," or they're just not in touch with it because they're so busy. So
sure.
that's one of the first things I try to get people to do is just listen to
Mhm.
what your body is trying to tell you.
Okay. But not so much to, as you said, attack the symptoms,
No.
but to, like, let's look, okay, what's the cause? What's the root cause? Or what's happening this week that we need to shift or manage so that this doesn't turn into something more inflamed,
More.
or less manageable, or more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
That's fantastic. So how could people reach out to you and get in connection with you if they're looking for some help with something like this? Because as you mentioned, you do see remote clients.
I do. I'm on both Facebook and Instagram at Angela Grover NTP, and my website is patternforhealth.com.
Great. And we'll link to those in the show notes. Anything, and you mentioned, I think you've got some materials or some things you can link to for people who want to like dig a little deeper into some of this stuff. I'll make sure to include that in the show notes as well. But thank you for joining me today, because this has been, I think, really helpful and enlightening for people who have heard some of these, words, these terms like leaky gut, like inflammation, and
Hmm.
yet they don't really realize, they're not connecting that to, um, one, behaviors, and two, how they might actually be experiencing some of these symptoms of this, and they're thinking it's just, oh, I ran a little extra last week, or
Exactly.
they're attributing it to other things. They're maybe almost ignoring their symptoms in the course of their busy life because those things are not priority.
Yeah.
And
Common.
or they might be considering giving positive attributes to a food that is really causing some of their problems, only because, not because it causes problems in everybody, but because it's individual to them, because there's a correlation to what's going on in their body when they eat it, but they're not grasping that connection, because so and so who looks fantastic on social media eats this way and thinks this is the best way to eat, and they look wonderful and they feel wonderful all the time, and I want to look like them. So I've got to
Yeah, always address the bio individuality of the client, and then always support, the foundations. And for with me, like I said, it always starts with properly prepared, nutrient dense whole food, and then we go into digestion and blood sugar. And there are some that come after that, but those are the first key three, because almost everybody has issues with those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you address those, and you've probably addressed the majority of the instigators of the problems. And people would feel a whole lot better if they addressing those three right out of the gate, I would imagine. So awesome. Thank you, Angela. I really appreciate your time, and I can't wait to get the feedback on this, because I think this, again, it's an area where there's a lot of buzzwords around,
Yeah.
but there's not a whole lot of unpacking of those words and in-depth understanding for your average person, because it's not explained, it's not talked about. The emphasis has been so on macronutrients from a 30,000-foot view, and calories,
Right. Right.
rather than how we're responding internally to these foods. And not to mention just that the whole message is completely out of whack and out of balance and wrong. So thank you again. I appreciate your time and your knowledge, and what I know about you, which is your care for the people that you meet with, and try to help, is that you have a sincere heart to serve people and help them. And that's why I wanted to bring you on here to share that. And I think people can sense that from our conversation. So, guys, you're having an issue, reach out to reach out to Angela, because she does care, and she has spent many years studying this, understanding, and has personal experience in her own, as she mentioned, her own struggle with Lyme disease. And it's when you have someone who has a personal walk in it, personal experience in it, you can't replace that. You can't replace that personal struggle with um, pure knowledge from a book. You know, you can't. And then, in addition to helping people over the years, time after person, you learn with each client. I know I do, but I know
Oh,
you learn something new from experience in a clinical setting with each client, that someone who is a researcher, who is spitting out health information, who spends their whole time looking at papers in a microscope, isn't going to gather, because they don't have the experience with an actual human. So I again, thank you again, and I look forward to having you back to unpack some of these in more detail at another time. But
yeah, I would love to. It's an absolute pleasure. I think the VLDL was how I met you, right?
Probably so.
Yeah, Zane's Instagram post on VLDL, and I was like, it's a personal trainer who knows what VLDL is, so
Oh,
that's how we connected. But it's absolute pleasure to be on, and you are a little bit of an enigma in your space, I think too. But I always enjoy having conversations with you. So thank you very much.
thank you, Angela.